Welcome to Preservation Perspectives, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation podcast. I'm your host, Luke Nichter. Recently, ACHP members voted to approve an exemption that releases any federal agency from the Section 106 requirement to consider the effects on historic properties of their undertakings involved in the installation and placement of electric vehicle supply equipment, otherwise known as EVSE, provided certain conditions are met. This action was in support of the Biden administration's commitment to converting the federal government's vehicle fleet to electric vehicles, which will require the installation of supply equipment. Today, we're talking to Jaime Loichinger, the ACHP's Assistant Director of the Office of Federal Agency Programs, who has led the ACHP's efforts to develop programmatic solutions toward this goal. Welcome.
Great, thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
On a personal note, at our recent ACHP business meeting, which I thought part of which you gave a very effective presentation on this topic, and also fielded some difficult questions because there is some complexity involved here in some of the issues. And so I thought, for the sake of our viewers who might not have known about your presentation, it's particularly the timing here is very good to appear on our podcast in order to give us an overview. So in doing that, let's start kind of right at the beginning. Tell me, how did the ACHP get involved with the electric vehicle supply equipment issue, which might not be so obvious?
No, definitely not. I think most of the questions I get when I hear people ask about, why did we do this exemption is kind of, what do electric vehicles even have anything to do with historic preservation? How are the two even linked? And my immediate answer is usually one of, electric vehicles, maybe not so much, but their supply equipment do, because of the installation having such ground disturbing actions, and then where they're placed is so visually important if you're in a historic district or in front of a historic property. We first became aware of the potential issue about, it was last summer. So summer of 2021, we were approached by the Department of Homeland Security. They had started hearing talk from, the plans for the spending bills that were going to be coming along the way about a huge increase in funding to support switching their fleet over from diesel and gas vehicles to electric vehicles. Obviously, procuring electric vehicles was not that hard to do, but they then needed the ability to charge all of those vehicles at all of their facilities. And they started kind of talking to us about, how are we going to get through hundreds of Section 106 reviews? We can probably do a programmatic agreement, but what efficiencies can we find within the Section 106 regulations? After a couple of meetings, we then started to realize this wasn't just limited to Department of Homeland Security. This was all federal agencies that have fleets that were going to need to electrify them. So it wasn't just a DHS issue. It ended up becoming federal-wide issue, government-wide issue. So that was when the ACHP said, maybe we should take this on and use our role, as we work with all the federal agencies, maybe use our role as a facilitator to look at the issue and see what solutions exist within the regulations. There's a lot of flexibility within them. So what can we find that would help agencies get through these reviews and make it happen in a really efficient and effective way, while also still meeting the responsibilities under Section 106 and the goals of the National Historic Preservation Act? How can we meet all of those and still not adversely affect historic properties? So that was kind of the impetus for where we started. And of course, it evolved from there over the last year or so.
You mentioned the ground disturbing characteristics of the supply and charging equipment. And so for those, this is common for us to talk about, but for those who aren't familiar with it, why is that an issue? And then once we recognized it was an issue, then how did we move to establish this exemption? How did the exemption come about?
Yeah. Thank you. So, the idea being that when you are putting these charging stations into place, who knows what's underneath the ground? In our work, it's not uncommon to encounter archaeological sites or, things pop up. We go in with the best of intentions, but we don't know what we might find when we start digging. So that was certainly one of the other aspects of the EV charging stations, was figuring out, are these in areas that are likely to have archaeological potential or have identified archaeological potential? So that was one of the things that we were trying to figure out when we were starting these discussions. which then actually dovetails really nicely into your next question about, how did we get to an exemption? And in talking with the agencies, talking with state historic preservation officers and, a number of other consulting parties, we started to think that there might be certain conditions under which you could install one of these charging stations and not have any effects on historic properties, or not have adverse effects on historic properties. So if you can place it in a way where maybe you don't have to dig, 3 feet deep because you're in previously disturbed soil that's already, like the first 2 feet have already been dug in for the signposts that are there, or, the parking bollards, those kinds of things. Or, if you start talking about visual effects, can you place it in a way that it's not above a certain height, or it's using compatible colors, complementary colors. You don't need a lot of new electricity. You can utilize existing electric infrastructure. So that was where we started looking at maybe this could fit into an exemption rather than a programmatic agreement, which is what DHS had originally talked to us about. So that was, and then from there, the conversation became, what other conditions are needed? How do we make sure that this is comprehensive when we look at the range of potential effects to a full comprehensive look at historic properties as well?
Well, it sounds like just a complicated process when you consider the range of agencies that must have been involved, the kinds of consultation required, the steps involved. So walk us through briefly, kind of what are sort of the tangible steps? I mean, what's the process like to enact an exemption like this?
So it was interesting because the last exemption that the ACHP had done was in 2004, 2005. So to some extent, we were figuring it out as we started it. We were kind of making it as we went along, using, of course, our experiences and whatnot, but trying to make sure that we had everyone at the table was really critically important. I would say timeline, DHS, like I said, came to us last summer. We had to get more specifics. So waiting for the certain bills to be enacted so we could have a sense of just how many agencies, just how many numbers, what is the range of the universe that we're working within. Then we did start having some initial discussions with technical experts, federal preservation officers, and their fleet managers in early 2022, earlier this year. And from there, starting in about March is when we really hit the ground on this, where we put together a consultation strategy that laid out 2 rounds of consultation with states, tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, consulting parties. We wanted to make sure that we had groups like statewide preservation organizations, local preservation organizations. We wanted to make sure that they knew about this and that they had an opportunity to participate as well. So that was probably the hardest part, was making sure we could also fit this in scheduling wise. We wanted to reach the biggest number of people, also recognizing summer is a really busy time for folks. It's hard to fit all of these meetings in and to also comment and to share the opinions. So we wanted to make sure we had enough time for those meetings, but then also enough time in between to thoughtfully reply to each comment, that we really went back and looked at what other changes could we make. And as you can imagine, the revision process on this went back and forth. I'm not a technical expert in electric vehicles either. I'm a historic preservationist, so I got a crash course in what felt like civil engineering at the time. Working with so many technical experts. So there were a lot of rounds of revision. So I would say, in earnest, we really began in March and then just wrapped it up at the end of October with
Wow.
the council. So
It was a big job.
Yeah.
And just so our audience is clear, what does the exemption do or say? What is the exemption?
Yeah, so most agencies in a situation where they have a project that could affect historic properties have to undergo a Section 106 review. What this exemption does is allows them to bypass that so long as their project still meets certain conditions, and that's what's laid out in the exemption. And that gets to a few of those things I was mentioning earlier about not exceeding previous ground disturbance levels, having complementary colors, utilizing existing electrical infrastructure, utilizing existing parking structures and facilities. So this, the exemption doesn't cover, for instance, new ground disturbance or new parking construction, it really utilizes existing things because that helps minimize any effects to historic properties. Of course, on the other hand, it doesn't mandate that agencies use this. It's an option, it's a tool for agencies. They don't have to use it. And for some agencies, we've already heard that what they're planning on does require, a modernization, if you will, of their electrical infrastructure at their facility. So they're going to undertake a standard Section 106 review. So I think that was the other sort of comfort level that we found in this, was that not everyone is going to use it, but when they do, it's going to minimize those effects. It'll keep it below that adverse effect threshold. And for the bigger projects that really do have a larger potential for effects to historic properties, they'll follow the normal Section 106 review, which has been used very well for the last 50 years. So,
you also, in your answer, laid out the process of consultation that was involved. Really, because I think the ACHP really prides itself on ensuring a maximum of consultation before doing much of anything. Yeah. Really, in order to make sure everyone's voice, first of all, that the right people are at the table, but that every voice is heard, during the process. So realizing that this is still pretty new, how would you characterize how this proposal, this exemption, has been received by the public, the preservation community, and especially Indian tribes?
I think maybe a little trepidation to start. Again, most folks, if you're in this realm of historic preservation, you're very familiar with something like a memorandum of agreement. You're very familiar with a programmatic agreement. Those are tools that that you see every day. There's a high degree of comfort. I think this one was a little bit challenging. Exemptions, like I said, the last one that was done was almost 20 years ago. So some of what we were encountering was just getting people used to the idea of it, helping them have some familiarity, some comfort with it, understanding how this fit within the regulations. So a lot of what our time in consultation was spent on was explaining this and explaining why it was included in the regulations and what the various thresholds are that we were trying to meet in ensuring that it could qualify for an exemption. So I think half of the time was spent on that. Since then, I don't think you hear anybody argue about the need to deal with the climate change crisis, and this is a huge part of that. So there's a lot of support for that. I think there were some questions about effects to historic districts, particularly downtown districts. How do you bring these charging stations in a way that's compatible with the feeling, the setting of those places? And that was feedback that we really used to then further refine the conditions that are within the exemption, so that, again, it may be an effect under the regulations in that you can see it, but that it's not rising to an adverse effect. It's not taking away, it's not diminishing those qualities that qualify a property for inclusion in the National Register. So we're still in early days. I know of a few agencies who are looking to start using it, testing a few of those out. So I expect we'll be updating our website pretty soon with some case studies and some scenarios so that people can start to see how it's playing out in real time. I think once it becomes less of a hypothetical and more of an actual, we'll start to see a lot more comfort across the board with it.
So with that in mind, then what happens going forward? Your last answer kind of suggested learning from this and gathering data and kind of creating feedback loops. But does this last indefinitely? Is there a sunset clause? Do we revisit it after a certain point? Like, where do we go from here?
The work is just beginning. Arguably, that was the easy part. Chapter 1. Now we go into chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5 of monitoring it. An agreement or a program alternative is only effective as how you monitor its implementation. So the exemption itself does have the ability to amend it. So as we learn more, if we need to go back and add in additional conditions or further revise or refine them, we can do that. We can bring it back to the membership and bring that suggested language for your all consideration. As far as reviewing it and monitoring it, we plan on using our Preserve America report, which is a triennial report where we go out every 3 years and query agencies on how they're meeting their Section 106 responsibilities, how they're using federal properties. We expect that we'll use that tool to also ask questions about how are they using the exemption. That's on a more formal level. On a day-to-day basis, we do the informal inquiries at a staff level, asking folks, how are you using this? What projects are you using it on? And like I said, too, we are looking at updating our website. The website that we had developed for this effort has now kind of just transitioned to, so it's done, here's additional information on how to use it. So we're updating that. Like I said, we'll be updating it with case studies, but also FAQs, some example scenarios, additional photographs, the classic, this is covered, this isn't, this is a good example, not covered by the exemption, like this would not be allowed. So that way people can start to see it a little bit more. And of course, I expect, at council business meetings, we always talk about program alternatives that are under development, but there's also the opportunity for us to report out on what we're hearing from agencies. And because we have so many federal members, the federal members have an opportunity to share with members like you how they're using it and what's gone well and maybe what needs additional information. So
no, I think it's true that anytime you're engaged in kind of a complicated, multifaceted project, there are surprises along the way, things that you learn that might be sometimes humorous, arduous, terrifying, things you learn that might help you with regard to this subject in the future, but also to other things. And I'm curious to know, from a personal standpoint, is there anything you learned along the way that was interesting, surprising, that might help you in maybe some other aspect of your work?
Yeah. I learned a lot about electric vehicles, which I had no familiarity with. I also learned I really don't know how electricity works. So that was, kind of a fun sort of thing of, how do these things hook up? How do they work? How far down do you have to go? But in all honesty, all joking aside, the biggest thing I learned was how much the technology on these have evolved even in a year. You look at when we started last year to now, the technology is so constantly evolving that when we started this last summer, those initial conversations with DHS, level 3 electric vehicle charging stations, which is the largest as far as its electrical capacity goes, that also at that time was typically seen as having the biggest footprint. It was the largest in size as well. Even in 1 year, now your level 3 charging stations are no bigger than level 2 charging stations, which are what you see on the streets, when you're walking down a downtown block. So it looks very similar to a parking meter, or it could even just be like those signs that you see of, this is parking space 4255 when you need to type it in, to pay your parking toll. So, and that's in 1 year. And actually, as we were getting ready to bring this to the membership, we were starting to hear about even new technology for some cities like New York, where there's not even a charging station. The charging station is like a manhole cover. That's how much it changed. And so I think one of the other things that we really held to was the technology every day is evolving on a weekly basis, and what we think of now as being these huge things really might not be. The same way that cell phones used to be, the bricks that we'd all have in our cars, and now we can fit them in our pockets. So I think that was probably the most surprising thing to me too. I know technology moves at lightning speed, but that was one thing that really caught me off guard and was certainly something to keep in mind for me as I go into consultation for new technologies, to remember that what's in front of us now could be very different in a year, 5 years, 10 years.
So interesting. And I think a good final question is, for those who want to know more, or maybe you want to learn how electricity works or how electric vehicles work, where can they go to find out more information?
Yeah, so head to our website. We have a pretty comprehensive page at this point that lays out what an exemption is, but also what electric vehicle charging stations are and what the universe is that's covered by the exemption. So if you head to our website, we'll probably drop a link into the show notes for this. But achp.gov, and from there you can navigate to our Section 106 portion of the page, and our program alternative section there will lay out not just the EV exemption, but all of the program alternatives if you wanted to really go down a rabbit hole of looking at the range of things that we kind of cover on a day-to-day basis, but particularly for EV. And like I said, that's a work in progress. That's updated pretty regularly at this point. We like to link to new articles, new offices even within agencies. For instance, there's a joint office with Department of Energy and Department of Transportation on electric vehicles. So we've got links to a lot of their materials there. So you can really become an expert in electric vehicles and electric charging stations pretty quickly.
Well, I just think that was a fabulous overview, and I just want to thank you again for being our guest today.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and talk with you guys about it. So appreciate the opportunity.
For our audience, be sure to follow the ACHP on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube to keep up with the latest in historic preservation news. I'm Luke Nichter. Thank you for joining us on Preservation Perspectives.